The convent bells rang for the final time. High in the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees shuddered beneath the autumn wind, a small group of nuns gathered inside their crumbling chapel. They prayed beneath fractured frescoes, saints whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of damp, smoke, and sorrow. On the distant ridgeline, fire flickered. Ottoman banners were already visible, strips of red cloth rippling across the mountains like sparks carried by the wind. The women understood the meaning instantly. No riders arrived from nearby towns. No soldiers remained to defend them. There was only the silence that comes before conquest. Their abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, stood before the altar holding a silver crucifix that had survived more than a century of storms. Her voice was barely a whisper. But she was wrong. When the empire's armies reached the convent gates, vows, prayers, and sanctity meant nothing to what history would later try to forget. If they breach our walls, keep your vows within your hearts. Those at least they cannot take. The first stones of the convent fell before sundown. Hymns that once filled the halls were drowned out by iron and screams. The Ottomans did not waste arrows on holy ground. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent was not sacred. It was defiance made visible, proof that the cross still dared to stand on conquered soil. Inside, the sisters hid what relics they could: silver chalices, embroidered icons, fragments of saints' bones buried beneath the chapel floor. They believed that if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. But the soldiers were not searching for treasure. They wanted proof, evidence that they had crushed not only armies, but belief itself. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were driven into the courtyard. Torchlight turned their white habits into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. They were told they would be taken before the Pasha, a promise few ever lived to see fulfilled. What followed became legend, so grim that even church chroniclers avoided recording it in full. By dawn, the convent was ash. Smoke rose from the refectory where the women had once shared bread and silence. Ottoman flags hung from the bell tower, signaling to nearby units that resistance was finished. Yet in the courtyard, something unexpected occurred. The soldiers waiting for screams heard singing instead. Bound with rope, the remaining sisters began to chant a hymn, not of despair, but defiance. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi. Their voices shook, but they did not break. The Ottoman captain, uncertain whether to mock them or silence them, ordered the abbess brought forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross taken from the altar. The captain offered her mercy. If she renounced her God and accepted the faith of the conquerors, her sisters would be spared. Her answer ended all negotiations. "I have already given my life," she said. "What more can you take?" For a moment, the captain hesitated. Perhaps moved, perhaps merely calculating. Then he turned away and left her to his men. What followed was never written in detail. Even Ottoman records, which celebrated victory without restraint, reduced it to a single phrase: discipline administered to those who refused reason. But in later European letters, her name appeared again. Eleni of Lissa became known as the nun who would not kneel. By midday, the convent's bells had been melted down for coin, and the cross from its rooftop shipped east as a trophy of conquest. Yet almost immediately, rumors began to move through the nearby villages. They said that when night winds swept through the ruins, voices could still be heard. Not crying, but praying. The smoke had barely lifted when the march began. What remained of the order, 22 women in torn habits, were driven south toward the coast, ankles bound, surrounded by Ottoman horsemen. They were not treated as prisoners of war, but as symbols. proof that even sacred walls could be broken. The journey was merciless. The sun burned the road beneath their feet. The sisters, many of whom had never stepped beyond their cloister, staggered from thirst and exhaustion. When one collapsed, another would lift her veil so soldiers would not trample it, small acts of dignity in a world stripped of mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her final words endured among them. If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other. After 7 days of walking, they reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships designed not for passage, but for control. The women were herded aboard, wrists chained to wooden benches once occupied by criminals and slaves. As the sails filled, the Greek coastline receded into the distance, carrying away everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Yusuf Ah, kept careful records: cargo, spices, coin, textiles, and religious captives. It was this ledger, discovered centuries later in the archives of Istanbul, that confirmed a story long dismissed as legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted 12 days. Storms battered the deck. Salt burned open wounds. Hunger hollowed faces. But what wore them down most was silence. No one spoke to them except to issue commands. They existed like shadows suspended between sea and sky. At night, the youngest among them, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms under her breath. Her voice was barely audible above the waves, yet chained prisoners nearby, Greeks, Serbs, Italians, turned their heads to listen. For brief moments, the sea itself seemed to pause. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters watched Constantinople rise from the water, domes and minarets glowing like blades in the dawn. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now it would become their cage. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. People stopped to stare. Christian nuns among captives were rare, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient walls toward the imperial district, where their fate would be decided. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, once the great cathedral of Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzin's call echoed from the minarets, one sister whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns. This was not a dungeon. It was the Divan-i Humayun, the imperial council, where the Sultan's will stood above all law. Here, captives were not judged by priests or kings, but by empire itself. And for the nuns of Thessaly, their faith was about to be measured against the laws of conquest. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, his expression carefully blank. To his left, scribes waited with ink and parchment, prepared to record everything: names, ages, classifications, intended assignments. Every detail would be entered into registers that still survive centuries later, pages stained with wax and time. The sisters stood in torn habits, eyes lowered. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy on one condition. Those who accepted conversion would receive new names, nourishment, and life within the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean confinement, disappearance, or worse. No one spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled. She had seen what happened to other captives brought before the council: Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, people swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could seize her, one of the elders stepped forward. Sister Deiris addressed the vizier not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay. "My lord," she said calmly, "you may rename us, but you cannot erase the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated before translating. When he did, The vizier's face did not change. "Prayers fade," he replied coldly, "when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a small gesture of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would later call this mercy. Others would call it something far worse. Beneath the palace gardens stretched a labyrinth of stone halls sealed from the sun. Each chamber held a narrow slit of light, barely enough to distinguish night from day. The women were stripped of their habits, clothed in rough garments and assigned to service, scrubbing floors, mending linens, feeding fires that warmed rooms they would never enter. It was meant to break them, to turn sanctity into servitude. But the empire misjudged them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger, cold, and solitude were familiar disciplines. For them, suffering was not punishment. It was devotion made tangible. At night they prayed in whispers. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into dust beneath her straw pallet. They began counting days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call, not as submission, but as a stolen measure of time for faith that refused to die. Whispers spread among palace servants, stories of silent foreign women buried beneath the halls, who never pleaded, never broke. Some called them cursed, others called them holy. Their silence echoed louder than prayer. Days blurred into months, hands blistered from labor, names were forbidden. Each woman was assigned a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed time and deprivation would eventually bend even the strongest conviction. That was when the next phase began. It arrived disguised as mercy. Food improved, oil lamps were provided, soft fabrics appeared in their quarters. Learned men came gently, speaking of rest, peace, and small freedoms, offers delivered not as threats, but as invitations. "Your God and ours are not enemies," one imam said softly. "Take our tongue, and you will be free." They all understood what that freedom meant. It meant erasure, forgetting names, memories, prayers, becoming something new only by destroying what had come before. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and shaking, began to steady the others. She whispered fragments of scripture remembered from the convent, verses half lost, reshaped into prayers strong enough to endure. Even broken, the words lived. When persuasion failed, the pretense ended. Torches were extinguished, food was reduced, the visits stopped. Silence and darkness returned. One by one, the women were summoned to a narrow chamber where scribes waited. Each was ordered to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who complied were removed and allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused were never seen again. It was not a single moment of brutality, but a slow, methodical dismantling of the will. Faith was not ripped away by force. It was worn down through hunger, waiting, and the quiet question whispered into the dark. Why suffer for a God who does not answer? A few broke. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally murmured the words. They were dressed in silk and led away. No one ever saw them again. For those who remained, each disappearance hardened resolve. Sister Dearest, who had spoken before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. "Call me Silence," she said. From that moment on, none of them spoke to their captors again. Questions were met only with stillness. And in that stillness, they reclaimed the one thing the empire believed it had taken: control. Official records mention them briefly. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else. living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. Guards called them ghosts in rags. Servants whispered of something stranger, that deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned. In those forgotten corridors where sunlight never reached, the survivors found something unexpected. A sealed archway buried beneath dust and stone. At first it was only a hiding place. Slowly, it became sacred. Broken pottery served as candle holders. A scrap of linen became an altar cloth. From a shard of shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross. Each night, after the palace slept, they gathered there. No hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman knelt and shared a memory, a home, a bell at dawn, the warmth of bread before prayer. These memories became their psalms, small offerings to a God who still listened in the dark. A Venetian prisoner once wrote of strange voices beneath the harem, women singing in Latin to a God not of this empire. For centuries, scholars dismissed the account as superstition. Until beneath the ruins of Topkapi, archaeologists uncovered a small chamber lined with Christian carvings, silent proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into stone, a Latin phrase half erased by time, lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. That small discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not vanished. They had resisted, not with weapons, not with rebellion, but with endurance. A silent revolt etched into stone. Within the hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once the weakest among them, became the axis of their faith. Charcoal in hand, she marked the walls. Names could not be written. Names were dangerous, so she invented symbols instead. A bird for each sister still alive. A small flame for those who had been lost. When a new bird failed to appear, they understood another had disappeared. The guards never found the chapel. Yet they began to notice something unsettling. Despite hunger, cold, and confinement, the women moved with a quiet calm that defied logic. Their eyes no longer pleaded. Their bodies bent, but their spirits did not. Overseers called it madness. Scribes wrote something else, unresponsive to correction. They had discovered a strength the empire could not measure. Their worship continued in secret for months, perhaps years. The palace above them changed rulers, servants, priorities. Below, the chapel remained. Their final act of defiance was not survival, but meaning. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of sisters remained, aged, diminished, nearly forgotten. Yet beneath the palace, the chapel endured, silent, hidden, unbroken. Centuries later, when modern excavators probed the foundations of Constantinople, they did not expect what they found beneath layers of marble and empire, carvings made by women who had prayed in darkness, fingerprints of faith pressed into stone. By 1482, the palace had changed hands again. A young sultan ordered a complete audit, every servant, concubine, and laborer meticulously recorded. Except one group. In the Topkapi archives, beneath columns of names, there is a blank space, a gap where 21 entries should be. The ledger reads only, unfit for service, disposed, no dates, no burial records, no explanations. This is how history erased them, not with fire, but with withheld ink. And yet silence became evidence. Only something dangerous is hidden so carefully. Later fragments surfaced. An Ottoman courtier's diary, preserved in Bursa, mentioned foreign women who refused submission and disappeared beneath palace foundations. A Venetian intelligence letter from 1484 spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, they revealed what official records denied: the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. The final trace of Sister Magdalena appears decades later in the account of an Italian pilgrim. He recorded a rumor told by a palace servant of a woman who sang to her God until guards sealed the room forever. Her name was forgotten, but the hymn lingered. In that echo, her story survived. Long after the empire moved on, servants whispered of cold air in the lower halls on full moon nights, of a faint scent of incense where no fire burned. Memory or superstition, it hardly mattered. What the empire tried to bury never truly died, because stone remembers, and faith, once carved into darkness, does not fade. Centuries later, European visitors drawn to the exotic mysteries of the Ottoman court began hearing fragments of the same forbidden legend. A French diplomat writing in 1712 recorded that among the oldest palace attendants lingered a story never spoken aloud in public, a tale of Christian women who sang themselves into heaven. He dismissed it as folklore, a superstition whispered by servants. But the stone had already told a different truth. The chapel lies in ruins now, buried beneath centuries of empire and silence, yet the carvings remain. Faded prayers cut into walls that once heard no mercy. Marks left by women who refused to let their faith die quietly. They were erased from records, reduced to blank spaces in ledgers, declared unfit, disposed of, forgotten, and yet they endured. In their silence, they still speak. If you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Sit with it. Carry it forward. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt when you faced what they endured. And if you want more histories buried in shadow, stories the world tried to forget, subscribe and step deeper with us into the dark. Because some truths demand remembrance, no matter how fiercely history tried to bury them.